Hello. Today is Monday, the 15th of August 2022. Yesterday, Sunday the 14th, I was supposed to have a live stream where I read live from my book, The Seed of Yggdrasill. Sadly, yesterday I had some technical issues. I hope that these will be fixed next time. Instead, I'm going to read while recording this and then putting it out for you all. So, all right, I'm going to start with chapter 1.4 from my book, The Seed of Yggdrasill. There's only the one seed, by the way. Chapter 1.4, Skaldskaparmál, Hidden Meanings in Poetical Metaphors. And there is a quote here, a quote that I referred to last time as well in the end. And I'll begin with this. Snorri Sturluson, in his introduction to the Prose Edda, says, "I wrote this book so that young students of poetry could learn to decipher that which has been composed in a subtle manner." So this was in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, and his stated intent that that young students of poetry in his day and ours could learn to decipher that which had been composed in a subtle manner, or as he says later in another passage in the same book, that which has been hidden in runes. And runes here means letters, like in the book, or symbols. So, Snorri's Skaldskaparmál, which means the telling of the creation of poetry, is the second book of his Prose Edda. The book begins with a story of how a man named Ægir, or Hler, arrives in Åsgarder. Now, Ægir, that is the name of the ocean giant, so it could just mean the sea, but it actually means the terrifying one. And like any other character in the Norse myths, he has got many different names, and one of them is Hler, which means wind-shielded. And as we shall get back to later, wind-shielded is the same as immortal, shielded from death. Well, so this Ægir arrives in Åsgarder, the world of the gods. And when someone arrives, especially an important visitor, you had to have a banquet, of course. So the gods arrange a banquet in Åsgarder. And in the banquet that follows, the giant is entertained by the tales of Bragi, the god of poetry, and husband of Idun. As the god of poetry, Bragi is a specialized aspect of Odin, whose very name means the poetry, and who actually gave us the poetry. Snorri used this story as an entry to his own explanation of the traditional Norse art of poetry. Through the mythical tales, we are introduced to the mythological background for the use of poetical metaphors, or what Snorri called heiti and kenningar. Snorri's mission was to make a study for young poets who want to learn the language of poetry and collect a treasure of old poetical words, and who want to understand that which has been cleverly disguised in runes. So, heiti are poetical words or synonyms that take the place of the nouns of everyday life. They are often old-fashioned words, no longer used that much, words that only survived as poetical words with the purpose of variation in the poetical vocabulary, and to add to the array of words to choose from in order to fit the rhymes. A kenning is also such a substitute, but in the form of metaphors. The word comes from the expression kenna vid, to know something by something else. A kenning will always consist of at least two parts, where the basic word is made known by the second word that describes the first word. However, each part may also be divided into a new two-part metaphor, so that one single kenning may consist of many parts. According to Margaret Clunies-Ross, Snorri's purpose must have been to show how the language of early Icelandic poetry expressed basic principles in the pagan Scandinavian religion. Snorri, she claims, was of the opinion that pagan poetry represented a serious attempt to understand the underlying principles of the cosmos. She believes that this has to do with a particular medieval trend where scholars assumed that the authors and the poets of the pre-Christian past had used metaphors and symbols that they called integumenta. Integumenta, that is Latin for coverings. That is cover words. And this was used in order to convey the inner meaning of their mythical narratives. And I personally believe that Snorri and his medieval contemporaries were correct in their assumption, and that pagan poets really did apply a metaphorical language conveying hidden meanings. In the Skaldskaparmál, Snorri continues to relate pagan myths, but this time with a more direct purpose of explaining metaphors. In my opinion, it would also seem that there is a hidden purpose, an esoteric revelation that must be deciphered, which basically has to do with the so-called red gold. After the first few chapters, metaphors for gold take a dominant role in Skaldskaparmál. We are never told exactly what the red gold is. We are given numerous examples of the metaphors for red gold found in lore and poetry, and several examples of the mysterious mythology and legendary material that surround the concept. As far as I have been able to understand, the red gold is in itself a metaphor, a symbol for the hidden divine knowledge that can only surface within a person through dire trials of initiation. One part of the Skaldskaparmál is a list of metaphors known as the Fylgjur, the lists or the recitals. These are important listings of metaphors for things and characters which tell us quite a lot about the characters and the things. In the chapter on the skaldic poem Haustlögn, which means prolonged autumn, in the chapter on the skaldic poem Haustlögn in this book, I will go through some metaphors and show how they serve to explain and subtly reveal the true meanings and functions of some important mythical characters in Old Norse poetry. Chapter 1.5, Hidden in Plain Sight, What Snorri Could Not Say. And I read again from Snorri Sturluson's Skaldskaparmál, Egil's comment about poetical metaphors. That, I think, has been cleverly disguised in runes, or in symbols, or in letters. So Snorri is saying here directly that meaning is cleverly disguised, subtly composed in symbols or in letters. And I read, the poems that constitute the lore of the fictional poetic Edda belong to a Norse poetic tradition in which metaphor, allegory, and parable was essential. Not only would the entire poem, like a riddle, be referring to mythical events that explain the poetical riddle, but basic mythical characters, even places, would themselves be presented in riddles. One particular character would be known by Kennavid, known by countless names, names that actually serve as metaphors to describe the character's essential nature, function, and meaning. People would understand which character is being referred to through these name meanings and the attributes accompanying the character. Strangely enough, when the Edda is translated into other languages, the translator hardly ever attempts to translate the names of characters and places, and tries even less to identify the real character behind the name metaphor. Names today are perceived as mere sounds without meaning, left as they are, or transcribed into a sound that fits better with the language of the translation. And that is when things get lost in translation, because the original Norse listener or reader would have understood the meaning of names, and they would have known how to decipher the real identity of the characters, while we today are left with hundreds of unintelligible, meaningless sound names. Thus, we are left with a translated poetry book where more than half of the meaning is missing. It is my mission to attempt to uncover the real meaning of the Edda myth, and thus I will attempt not only to translate names literally, but also attempt to identify the real character or meaning behind the name through the use of metaphor. And this is not as controversial as it may seem. Norse linguists are well aware of the metaphorical nature of the myth and the fact that names have a meaning and may be covers for other characters. It is no secret that Snorri Sturluson wrote his prose Edda in an attempt to explain the real meaning behind the poetical metaphors. This was, in fact, his stated intent, as we have already seen. And without his work, we would have understood nothing at all of the Edda poems, and even less about the Skaldic poems. Now, the problem with using Snorri as a source to Norse myth is that his work was also biased. He was possibly a devout Christian who loved his pagan ancestry and thus desperately tried to make it more acceptable to the church. Or he was a secret pagan who desperately tried to preserve the myths in a fashion that would hide pagan messages in plain sight. Snorri's way of making the pagan ancestry acceptable was by explaining away the gods as actual ancestors, human ancestors, that were misjudged by their descendants and turned into false gods. Because the church would not look kindly upon pagan gods, or they were called demons or idols, but it would not mind ancestors, even if people had mistaken them for gods, as long as this mistake was made clear, as Snorri made sure of. The church would not accept pagan doctrines of salvation and resurrection, but it would accept ancestral history. So there is a reason why Snorri's work on the pagan myths was known and accepted throughout the Middle Ages, while the poetic Edda manuscript and all the other manuscripts containing Edda poems, almost all of them were gone, and the one that survived was hidden away for 4 centuries. One curious aspect of Snorri's work is the repeated failure to describe or explain mythical events that directly describe initiation and resurrection. Events that are described in the clandestine poetic Edda. There is no way that Snorri was unaware of these passages. In fact, such passages often constitute the climax of a poem. The omission of the very climax of a story otherwise told in full, and the fact that these omitted parts always deal with pagan concepts of resurrection and initiation, is so thorough that I suspect his silence to be intended as a pointer towards what we should in fact look for in the Poetic Edda. Before I am accused of professing mad conspiracy theories, I think that my suspicion should be considered in the light of factual knowledge that educated people in the Middle Ages really were big on codes, coded messages, and riddles such as these. The difficulty with translating names, and the reason, I hope, why so few try, comes when you actually try to do the translations and the interpretations. If one is to come close to the original meaning, this requires an understanding of the mythology as a complete system of beliefs. And since we are not actual insiders of this previous culture, such an understanding will be a matter of interpretation, a question of how we understand the myth and the culture in which they were nourished. Chapter 1.6 Other Sources of Old Norse Mythology. And I read from a quote by Snorri Sturluson in his prologue to the Heimskringla, which is another work of his. But the old songs, skaldic poetry, I believe are the least faulty as historical sources, if they are correctly rendered and wisely grasped. So, other sources of Old Norse mythology. We have skaldic poems. One important type of existing source is the skaldic poems. These were composed by named skaldic bard poets during the Viking Age. So these are actually windows into the pre-Christian world. They are rendered exactly as they were composed during the Viking Age era. Most of the surviving poems focus on praising kings and warriors or describing battles that have taken place, reflecting the poetry of a Viking Age chief's court. Some of them describe myths, such as the poem Haustlang, which means prolonged autumn, which we will be exploring in chapter 4. Whether the poems are dealing with almost journalistic reportage and propaganda, or with more subtle issues, they all base their poetic language on metaphors firmly rooted in a mythical worldview. Thus, even the metaphors that applied to the most mundane of matters may offer insight into the mythology of the Viking Age. Then we have Saxo Grammaticus, Gesta Danorum. Another written source to Old Norse mythology is found in the work of Saxo Grammaticus, who lived sometime between 1150 and 1220. He was a Danish scholar who, in the year 1208, finished his work in the Latin language Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes. Like Snorri, Saxo described the pagan gods as ancestors, particularly devious and immoral ancestors without much honor. Saxo obviously harbored a very hostile attitude to paganism, and the Aesir, the pagan gods, were presented as human beings of particularly wicked and demonic persuasion. So he has a very different attitude from that of Snorri. Snorri is a great storyteller who wrote in his own language and who had an obvious sympathy for the old stories and the old gods. While Saxo is good at rendering these stories, but he comes up with a lot of moral condemnation preaching in between the stories. His book nevertheless provides some interesting additions to and versions of the Norse myths. Then we have sagas of families, kings, and other chronicles. So, sagas of kings and of great Icelandic families often provide invaluable insight into Norse folklore and pagan practices. The only problem with the saga sources is that those who wrote them down would decide what and how to write things down on the basis of their own medieval and, of course, Christian conceptions. So they were often very cryptic and sometimes directly hostile to the pagan practices that they were describing, especially towards witchcraft and sorcery, which held an important and age-old function in the pagan era, but which was, by the time of writing sagas, condemned as utterly evil. They would also sometimes briefly refer to practices that they assumed that their audience would recognize and understand without further explanation or description, showing that these practices were still known and applied, or at least remembered. So they are directing themselves to an audience that they expect to understand what's going on, while we today may be a bit confused. So our biggest problem today is that we have to figure out for ourselves what it is that the poets or the saga writers took for granted that the people knew. One very important saga for the student of mythology is the Flatøyarbok, which contains several sagas as well as short stories and myths, and the Edda poem Hyndluljod, the Song of the She-Wolf, which is not present in the main Edda manuscript, where several pages had been torn out, however. So there were obviously a few pages with poems that did not survive whoever tore these pages out. Then we have the sagas of old times. Some sagas, the Fornaldarsögur, which means the sagas of the olden times, were not about famous families or royal courts, but claimed to be the heroic lore of Viking Age ancestors, going all the way back to the Iron Ages, to the age of Attila the Hun, the Emperor Augustus, the Roman era, and the Hunnish era, the migration era in Europe, which was between about the year 0 until about the year 500. But these stories, although they often describe a time period far back in time, they were written down quite late, no earlier than the 13th century. But they tell of Iron Age and Viking Age men and women who gained some reputation in their lifetimes, and often these stories contain strong elements of myth and folklore. The heroes frequently move into other worlds and encounter supernatural beings. It is often possible to recognize pagan mythical characters and pagan activities such as initiation rituals and magic. As many of you, my patrons, know, I have already made a whole series of lectures on the theme of Fylgjur, great knowledge. Stories about Seder and initiation, and I use these sources a lot because they are quite rich actually when you start looking for it, quite rich in mythology and in ritual descriptions actually. Alright, then we have source criticism. Altogether, the sources do not provide an insight into the entirety of Old Norse paganism, but only into a few of the themes and stories that were remembered by descendants, officially Christian descendants, between 1 and 3 centuries after the conversion. Thus, we have to be careful not to take everything the sources say about pagan beliefs at face value. In the case of the sagas especially, attitudes towards magic and magical performers show clear signs of Christian influence, wherein pagan practitioners are demonized. After the conversion, legal texts show that new laws were quickly introduced, discriminating and oppressing pagan practitioners, women, homosexuals, and cross-dressers of both gender. Legislation is a powerful changer of attitudes. Suddenly they had laws against same-sex couple living together. They had laws against women doing whatever they wanted. And of course they had laws against pagan practices. There is a passage in the Flatøya book, in the short story of Eirik Vidfarne, where Eirik, he travels from Sweden or Denmark to Constantinople to talk to the Christian emperor of Constantinople, or Miklagar as they knew it. And he asks about Christianity, and the emperor replies he answers his questions, and Eirik asks, so who are the people who go to hell? And the emperor replies, they are the evil people, the bad people. And then Eirik asks, who are the evil people? Who are the bad people? And the emperor replies, and this is where it gets surprising for us, because being evil or bad has nothing to do with how you actually treat other people, or how evil you actually are when you act in the world. No, the emperor replies very simply that evil people and bad people, they are the pagans or the heretics. These are the bad peoples. That was what the church, the medieval church, considered to be evil and bad back then. Not being a Christian, basically, and not being a Christian of the right doctrine was also being evil. So if you were a Christian, if you were a good Christian and followed the rules of the church, then your actual actions in the world and how you treated other people didn't matter. It was all about beliefs. So anyway, thus, legislation is a powerful changer of attitudes. Thus, the presentation of trolls, sorcerers, witches, and magical arts are usually negative, which is probably a Christian rather than a pagan attitude, since paganism embraced witchcraft and sorcery and included people who defied the usual gender roles. In my opinion, however, the themes, storylines, structures, and symbolic elements of the sources point to a pagan origin. The structures of initiation rituals that can only have emerged in a pagan context are very dominant in much of this lore. Several images from Viking Age art or earlier appear to be illustrating well-known myths. Other themes are recognizable from comparative mythology that is certainly ancient, such as the Vedas dating back thousands of years. It is also becoming more and more clear to Scandinavian medieval students that the pagan religion and worldview took a very long time to dissolve in the minds of common people. In fact, several hundred years passed before many pagan concepts were forgotten or had lost their original meanings. It took centuries. As Snorri observed in 1225 AD, which was 220 years after the Icelandic conversion to Christianity, and 120 years after paganism had been outlawed, because after the conversion in the year 1000 in Iceland, it was still legal to be a practicing pagan until about the year 1100. So when Snorri wrote, it was 120 years after paganism had been outlawed. And it was 220 years since Christianity became the official state religion of Iceland. And this is when Snorri observes that young people in his age were about to begin to forget the beliefs of old. About to begin to forget. That was why he wrote his book, because he realized that within a generation or two, people are going to forget. They're not going to know this anymore. But it took a couple of centuries. Okay, chapter 1.7, My Methods of Interpretation. And I'm going to read from a poem from the Håvamål, stanza 144. Håvamål, that means the speech of the High One. And the High One is a metaphor for Odin. Veist du ved rista skall, veist du, ved råda skall, veist du, ved fåa skall, veist du, ved fresta skall, veist du, ved bidja skall, veist du, ved blota skall, veist du, ved senda skall, veist du, ved soa skall. Do you know how to carve? Do you know how to interpret? Do you know how to color? Do you know how to test? Do you know how to ask? Do you know how to offer? Do you know how to send? Do you know how to stop? Triptych. That by which a thing is known. So I apply 3 main methods whenever I approach a prose story or a poem, a stanza or a line of Old Norse mythology. The first method is to interpret the poetical metaphors. There is absolutely no doubt that the Norse poets used metaphors to disguise characters and phenomena. They had 2 main types of metaphors: the kenningar, that by which something is known or that by which someone is known, and heiti, nicknames. The Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson wrote his entire prose Edda as a thesis on how to create and how to decipher the metaphors of kenningar and heiti, and how to understand the cultural, mythological, historical background to many famous metaphors used in the lore that Snorri knew about, much of which we also know about. Because without his thesis, we would never have been able to understand skaldic poetry, which was based almost entirely on such metaphors, and the poems of the poetic Edda would also have been quite indecipherable for us. Snorri stressed the importance of realizing that there were subtle meanings hidden in words, letters, and songs. The meaning of names. The second method I apply is the so-called philological method applied to names. It is of utmost importance, if we want to get a true understanding of the myths, to interpret all names, whether they are the names of characters, things, or places. These names are always meaningful. For the most part, they are disguising an underlying character, or rather an underlying universal trait, and the choice of nickname, the choice of heiti, describes the function of this character or trait in the particular context in which it appears. Now, to be safe, I usually refer to interpretations that may be found in Rudolf Siemek's Dictionary of Northern Mythology, which is a compilation of various interpretations of names offered by various esteemed linguists. I choose the interpretation which, based on my own research, I believe is the most accurate. Sometimes I choose interpretations found in other secondary sources, some of which may be slightly controversial, such as when I translate the name Menglöd as invitation to blend, or invitation to a blend, a drink. And I choose this rather than the more common necklace of joy or similar that her name is usually referred to in most translations. But this interpretation, Menglöd, invitation to a blend, was proposed and explained by the Icelandic author Svava Jakobsdottir in an essay about the sacred mead, and I agree wholeheartedly with her interpretation of the name, which has not been proven to be wrong either. There are also several instances where I myself have the audacity to make interpretations of my own based on the use of dictionaries. An example of this is when I translate the name Gylfaginning as gold power drink. And this is actually a literal translation based on the assumption that the name is derived from the words gull for gold and the word veigr, which means a drink or a power drink. And the word veigr is for drink is a word that often appears in the context of the sacred mead, the precious mead of poetry, memory, and wisdom. It is often referred to either as mead, mjöður, or as a veigr, dyrar veigr, the precious drink, the precious mead. So the word veigr means a drink, a power drink, a powerful drink. So the reason why the name Gylfaginning is not usually interpreted on the basis of such a literal translation as my own is because one famous scholar, Thorvald Petre, back in the 1930s decided that the name indirectly, not directly, but indirectly meant greedy for gold. And his interpretation is not based on the actual meaning of any part of the words that make up the name. It is but an imaginative paraphrasing based on his interpretation of the myth about Gylfaginning and why she is punished. It seems that no later scholars have dared to or even considered challenging this paraphrasing of the name Gylfaginning. Through my own studies, I found Thorvald Petre's interpretation of the name Gylfaginning must be based on an erroneous interpretation of her myth, and that it makes more sense to stick to the literal translation of her name, as I proposed in my 2004 thesis, The Maiden with the Mead, and as I will be explaining further on in this book. Whenever I propose my own translations, I usually give an account of why I interpret the name the way I do. There are some interpretations that may be very uncertain. For example, when I propose a new interpretation of the name Embla, but which I have let stand with an explanation because it makes sense within the greater context of how I decipher the mythology at large. And the responsibility for any error in these regards is, of course, my own. Now, reading myth as parable. You know, the Bible has got a lot of parables where something happens and it's really about God and the soul. And this is very much true also of pagan myth. So my third method, well, my first method was to interpret the poetical metaphors. The second method is to always interpret the names. And the third method is to approach all myths as parables that must be deciphered through discovering the basic structure or the formula that carries the story. This approach is inspired by two Norwegian authorities on the field. Professor Gro Steinsland, who was the head of the Nordic Medieval Studies Department at the University of Oslo, interprets myth by revealing and defining what she refers to as mythological models in the sources, underlying models that may bring us closer to genuine pagan beliefs. And then we have Eldar Heide, another Norwegian authority on the field, who in his 1997 thesis on the Edda poem Fylgjur explains that the Norse myths must be read as parables, where it is not the details of the story, but the underlying structure behind the details that actually provide the meaning and the ritual religious background to the Edda poems. I myself applied a similar method in my own thesis, where I looked at the basic themes of a story and how the themes followed a chronological pattern that was identical to countless other seemingly different stories. And this was how I discovered the same sort of story of a pagan initiation ritual behind several different myths. Comparative mythology. Like all mythologies, the Old Norse is the result of many cultural, religious, and philosophical influences gathering over long time spans. The shamanism and the animism of the Ice Age ancestors run like powerful undercurrents throughout the entire Edda lore. The religions of the Neolithic and megalithic cultures of Stone Age Europe would have provided another powerful current, as would the entry of warlike tribes from the southeast of Europe arriving towards the end of the Stone Age. There was a possible fusion between these three main groups of old cultures all living together in Scandinavia happening during the Bronze Age, together with the influence of the sacred marriage ritual that began in Sumer in Mesopotamia and the classical mystery schools that originated possibly in Minoan Crete. Then we have shamanistic Sami and Siberian cultures who would continue to interact with the Norse throughout the entire era. Then there was the influence of Celtic and Roman and Eastern European Iron Age cultures and the entry of Mongolian Huns, and finally we know that the early Viking Age was powerfully influenced by Arabic culture and fashion especially through trade and travelling, as well as becoming influenced by early medieval Christian attitudes. But so basically, Norse mythology is a result of a long and endless row of various different cultures meeting and fusing over time, over long stretches of time. But like a language and like a culture, a mythology, being the result of long-term, ever-changing and ever-evolving developments, is the fusion of countless different influences, and still it's like a time capsule, a time capsule capturing a moment of fusion between historical streams. Yet it is also a fusion that is at all times whole and complete in itself. Take a language, for example. A language consists of lots of age-old and newer influences that have been happening all the time for thousands and thousands of years. The language you speak is the result of fusions going back time, long time ago, into times when people had completely different sets of minds, and still and in the future the language you speak is also going to change in the same way. That's how languages work, that's how cultures works, and that's how mythology work as well. They are all the result of countless fusions, and they're going to change in the future. But at this point, when they are written down, you sort of capture this mythology at one in one place, and it's meaningful and whole in itself, just like a language. The language you speak, even though it comes from many different fusions, many different roots, and even though it's going to change in the future, and it's always changing, it's still a complete system of its own just right now. So like a language or a culture, a mythology is a complete and self-explanatory system on its own. We do not need to look to outside sources in order to find meaning in the myths, as they exist within a complete mythological system. Reviewing various possible influences from other systems of belief may throw light upon the history and the original meanings of particular aspects of the myths, and may also provide clues as to meaning. When the meaning of a myth or a mythical character seems difficult to decipher. However, I have found that in Old Norse mythology, at least, even the most universal symbol takes on a life of its own. The myths were composed and transmitted by professional storytellers, and most of them were initiated into the art of poetry through sacred ritual and sacred learning. The storytellers had an agenda of their own, and they would shape mythology according to their message. They would be playing on the associations that were already there, and they would be emphasizing what they thought would best serve the transmission of their message. Comparative mythology is very interesting and has been an important part of my research. However, I find that the deciphering of the messages themselves, the messages that the poets attempted to convey through metaphor, is the most interesting and least researched aspect of Old Norse myths. So this is why I rarely apply comparative mythology in this book, except when I really believe it may help to deepen our understanding of the underlying messages. Nevertheless, I will add some very relevant examples here from comparative mythology in order to illustrate why the idea of Norse myths being parables is not as far-fetched as it may seem. When I studied history of world religions at the University of Oslo, a part of the bachelor degree consisted of specializing in one of what they actually refer to as the great religions. So specializing in Old Norse paganism was sadly not an option before the master level. So I picked the modern great religion that I suspected would be closest to what I really wanted to study. I chose Hinduism. Because like paganism, Hinduism is a polytheist religion with many different sub-traditions. And much of this Indian religion has grown out of an ancient Vedic religion that has proved to possess several crucial linguistic and thematic similarities to Old Norse religion, suggesting that they may share some very ancient common origins. I was very pleased when I first found in one of the textbooks an analysis of the old Indian epic Mahabharata, which means the great story. And this epic dates back to around 400 before Christ. That was when it was written down, anyway. So the story itself could be older. And it was, I found the analysis, how this story was understood, not by the lay people who would just hear a nice story, but by learned Brahmins who had sort of a deeper understanding of the story. So in the Mahabharata, there are 6 main human characters. They are the princess Draupadi and her 5 husbands, who are all brothers. The story relates their challenges and how the brothers lose their shared wife in a game of dice and how they have to win her back. The great story includes the famous and sacred revelation known as the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna, an avatar, an aspect of the great god Vishnu, acts as a so-called chariot driver, who reveals sacred knowledge to the passenger of the so-called chariot, the warrior prince Arjuna. Now the story is a great read in itself, but what is interesting to us is that the deeper meaning of the story is hidden in metaphors. Draupadi, the princess, it's not just a woman who has the fortune or misfortune of possessing 5 husbands. She is a metaphor for the mind, and her husbands represent the 5 senses. The whole story is about how these 6 aspects of internal human experience relate to each other to the surrounding world and to God. Knowing this, the whole experience of reading the story is transformed. It's about about forces dwelling and existing and acting within the human being. Many different personalities representing different parts of your being existing inside of you. We tend to think of Hinduism as we do of paganism, as a polytheist religion, that is, a religion with lots of different gods and goddesses. However, within polytheism, there is room not only for many different gods, but also for many different ways of understanding them. Within Hinduism, there are many examples of philosophical or spiritual trends where the many different deities are seen as representations of different aspects of the one supreme being, where male and female deities simply represent different virtues of this one supreme being. One such trend is represented by Krishna Bhakti, which is a devotional trend which at times during the last 5 decades, or 6 decades now since I wrote the book, Krishna Bhakti has gained a certain popularity also in the Western world, and they are known for their particular clothing and for dancing and singing in the streets, chanting Hare Krishna, Rama, and so on. The trend, however, is not a New Age trend in India. It's very, very old. And it's a trend that recognizes Krishna as the most complete manifestation of the Supreme Being. So Krishna is God, basically, the Supreme God, the one that encompasses all the others. So all the other gods and goddesses do exist as well, but they are part of the great Supreme Being. They are within, like, forces within him again. So Krishna is like the most full picture of the unified deity, the one that all other deities are simply aspects of. Now, one of the most important Krishna myths is about how the god roams the countryside while playing the flute. This is God playing, and the local shepherd girls, called gopis, are hypnotized by the divine music, and they come flocking in order to listen to his music. And they all fall violently in love with the divine musician. So, how does Krishna, God, react when all these girls fall in love with him at the same time? There are hundreds of them, thousands. And rather than choosing one girl above the others, he separates himself into several hundreds of images, and in this way he manages to make love to all the shepherd girls at the same time, and everybody is happy. Now, this may sound a bit funny to us if we read the story literally, but Krishna devotees do not, in fact, read this myth literally. They read it as it was meant to be read, as a parable. Because despite appearances, this is not the story of an extremely lustful and promiscuous God. No, this is a story about how God is capable of giving his full attention and having a personal and deep relationship to every individual human being at the same time. The shepherd girls, the gopis, are not in fact shepherd girls. They are metaphors for the individual human soul, or individual human souls, whether male or female. So we are all the gopis. We are all the shepherd girls, whether we are men or women or whatever. We are the shepherd girls in this story. And our being in love with Krishna is our devotion to the divine. So the story is about the union between the individual souls and the divine, the whole, the one. The message is that every individual can have a strong, personal, loving relationship with God, which is very intimate. So, and the fact that everybody can have this intimate relationship to God, it's because God takes a different aspect of himself or herself when relating to each individual. So we all get our own little version of the whole one. So the concept that individual human souls of both sexes may be represented by a certain mythological category, such as the shepherd girls, and the metaphor of sex for union with the divine, are very important concepts to carry with us when we study not only Hindu mythology, but also when we study Old Norse myth. Because we do have many examples. For example, take sex. The relationship, the sexual relationship with a human being and a divine being in ancient mythological stories is always about the union with the divine. You find this in all over the ancient world, in the mystery religions, and you find it in all kinds of mysticism. Mysticism is something you can find also in the three monotheistic religions. Actually, you have a mystic Christian traditions, mystical Jewish traditions, and mystical Islamic traditions such as Sufism, and they all describe the love, the devotion for God is always like being in love, like a lover, and also having a sexual union. Is actually, it actually doesn't mean sex. It means that your soul is uniting with the divine. It's a very, very ancient and very widespread concept, and it does appear also in Old Norse myths, just as it does in the Indian myths. So the same is the idea that the mind and the senses and other internal virtues of human experience may be represented by mythical and legendary beings. It is revealed in tantric meditation that the gods and goddesses, as well as demons and ogres, represent internal human qualities residing in the numerous chakras of the body and soul. So within our body, within our physical and energetic body, the various gods and demons and goddesses, they all exist within us, just as they exist in the greater world. Like above, so below, we have the same forces within us as the forces that constitute the whole universe. The great goddess, for example, is pictured as a serpentine power, a sleeping power residing at the lowest part of the spine or in the womb area. She is also called Shakti, which means power, the dynamic energy that makes life and movement possible. But she lies coiled down there in your roots, down there, and she's sleeping within most people. So the great god likewise resides on the top of the head, the crown chakra, representing the silent observer. The great god and the great goddess, the divine couple, are both cosmic entities, polar opposites who once were one, united, the supreme being. Yet at the same time, they also exist within each of us, within all who live. The goal of Tantrism is to wake the goddess from her slumber so that she may rise up through the spine like a rising serpent, the Kundalini, and be reunited with her long-lost husband, the god. When they are together in perfect union, the individual who has achieved the union within themselves will not only be empowered, but also spiritually awakened and enlightened. On the path up through the spine, the practitioner will encounter many other entities from the Hindu pantheon, external divine and magical powers that also reside within and represent internal human virtues and emotions. To understand the divine in this way appears alien to most Westerners today because for the last 1 to 2,000 years we have been culturally conditioned to regard the divine as something outside of and above ourselves. We have forgotten the older, more fluid and pragmatic state of mind where the borders between cosmic dimensions, where separation between entities and the dualism between creation and the creator did not yet exist. The pagan worldview was quite like pagan art. Everything interacts, overlaps, and transforms into everything else. From this ancient and very fluid perspective, what is true of the original cosmos is also true of individual life. We all carry the entire creation and its creators within. And even with their long established names and personal characteristics, the deities are changeable and mutually overlapping with each other, representing something far more sublime than can ever be accurately described in human language. We also tend to think that a god or goddess ought to be perfect and all-knowing. But this is not the case in Old Norse myths either. Just as the gods and goddesses are as much inside of us as they are outside of us, so the degree of their power, their wisdom, and their mere awakenedness always depends on the person who carries them within. Odin, despite being the Norse counterpart of a great god, is not in fact all-knowing. Rather, he is that internal drive of inspiration and curiosity which always seeks knowledge. The all-knowing one is his wife, Frigg, but she refuses to reveal her knowledge, being the silent observer. So in many ways the basic concept here is equal to that of Tantra, only that the genders have switched roles. Here, in the North, here it is the goddess who is the silent observer, while the god is the passionate, dynamic seeker. It's exactly the opposite. But yet the same notion. The spirit of paganism, as well as of many Hindu trends, is one of mystery, curiosity, and personal revelations, rather than the obsessively doctrine-enforcing monotheism that has long ridden large parts of the world. And where great wars have been fought for the incredibly absurd reason that one group cannot accept that the other groups have different mental images and ideas about divine reality and divine descent. This highly impractical way of thinking was unknown to most ancient religions before monotheism. We may look to the old Indian text Rig Veda and see that the attitude towards knowledge and towards the divine is flavoured by the realization that nobody, not even the highest of gods, may really know the true nature of the universe. And I quote from the Rig Veda: "No not being was, and being was not. There was no air, no heaven there above. What was it hiding? And where was it? In whose care? Was it perhaps water, or vast emptiness? There was no death, and immortality was not. No difference between day and night. Silently, only the one breathed its own support. There was nothing else, nothing outside of it. Darkness was there, in darkness hidden from the start. An ocean, all of it, in which nothing was distinguished. The one was empty, closed off, with emptiness. Then it was set to glow, and so it came into existence. Desire was the first, then, that came into being. It was the very first seed of the soul. That bond which connected being to not being, the wise found when searching in their hearts. From where the great world sprang, if someone created it or not, yes, the one who steers it all in heaven above may know, and maybe he knows not. Yeah, so the loss of this mental flexibility, this curiosity, and this acceptance of no knowledge, especially where religions are concerned, is why we often fail to understand the true nature of pagan deities. Even those who believe in the old gods today often fail to realize this, wanting to worship something that is separate from and above them. Often eager to establish dogmatic truths and dogmas regarding the highly separate roles of the gods, their moral values, their family relations, the geography of their abodes, and their hierarchy. This kind of attitude has little to do with original paganism, where the gods are all mutually able to replace each other and take new names and new shapes according to a given situation, where family relations and tribes are metaphorical and fluid, where gods and goddesses are known to have changed over time and with different local traditions, and where gods and human beings in reality share the eternal quest for knowledge and completion. We do not have to go all the way to India to find other comparative religions. The Greek-Roman empires created a widespread Hellenistic and later Roman culture which flourished from the time of Alexander the Great and until the Goths sacked Rome towards the end of the 4th century after Christ. We are speaking about almost 800 years where the whole Mediterranean region was a great cultural melting pot, knowing countless different goddesses and gods. We also know that at least since the early Bronze Ages, there was a considerable degree of contact between Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and the Mediterranean world. The Greek historian Herodot, who lived during the 400s before Christ, briefly described Scandinavians as Hyperboreans, people from beyond the north wind, in his histories. Interestingly, the story he relates is one regarding religion, where two priestesses from Scandinavia carried holy objects from tribe to tribe until they reached the Greek island of Delos, where they finally offered the mysterious holy object that they had been carrying for a long time throughout while they moved southwards throughout Europe. And they carried it to the temple of Artemis, the great goddess of the Delians, and apparently of the Scandinavians. The priestesses had walked all the way, accompanied by 5 men who were there to guard them. They ended up in Delos, where they were regarded as sacred women, and they were buried in a very sacred grave right at the entrance to the temple of the goddess. Herodot had seen the sacred grave himself and observed the rites and offerings surrounding the grave, and thus explains in detail why he finds the story credible. Later, relations between the Germanic tribes and the Roman world were often far less friendly, but the relation was there, and Roman influence reached deeply into many different levels of the world of the Germanic tribes, and thus eventually also to Scandinavia. There is no doubt that the flexible way of understanding divine realities also opened up for interaction and overlapping between German, Scandinavian, and Roman concepts, as seen in the many shrines to German deities with Latin inscriptions and Latin names, often identifying German gods with Roman and Greek ones. Thus, Wodan or Odin became Mercury to the Romans. Tivas or Tyr became Mars to the Romans, while the thunder god, Thor, alternated between being Jupiter or Hercules. Aegir was Neptune, and the countless German goddesses were either just called Matronae, which means mothers, or else sometimes identified, if not always in name, so in attributes and functions, with known Roman goddesses such as Venus, Juno, Libera, Fortuna, Isis, and Cybele. The latter two were not originally Roman, but had gained enormous popularity within the Roman Empire. Where the Germans had earlier only worshipped in open air spaces such as groves, caves, and peaks, they now began to build temples in the Roman fashion. Such intense religious interaction may have meant that certain religious trends may have reached Scandinavia, if such trends were not already there, a result of much earlier interactions and continued mutual influencing both from prehistoric times and during the Roman Iron Age. When I studied the structure of initiation in Old Norse myths, I discovered that the structure as well as the thematic content of each stage are staggeringly similar to the structure of a Roman initiation story which describes an initiation into the mysteries of the goddess Isis. Since I will be returning to this subject, I will just explain briefly that the classical mysteries were initiation schools or sects which believed that the soul, the human soul, the individual soul, could be saved from oblivion and dissolution in misty Hades, the world of the dead, if only the individual would go through an initiation while being still alive. The initiation included a symbolic death and many esoteric teachings. At the heart of the Isis mysteries lay the idea that the goddess Isis was the most complete representation of the universal supreme being, but that she also hid behind all other goddesses that are worshipped in the world, as well as being the source of all the gods that are worshipped in the world. So she is the source and the real face behind all divine appearances and characters. And this way of regarding the divine is pantheist, meaning that there is a belief in a mysterious unity behind the many deities, a common origin or core to all the countless faces of divinity. The great secret of the mysteries, the ultimate trial that would eventually lead to resurrection and salvation in death, was to unite with the goddess, the individual human soul to be united with the original divine universal soul. And Isis represented this ultimate universal soul. Crucial to the Isis mysteries is the very ancient myth of Isis and Osiris. This myth was important in Egypt for thousands of years before it became the genesis of the Isis mysteries in Rome. Whereas the myth could be interpreted in many different ways, there is little doubt that the initiates of Isis understood this myth as a parable for the quest of the human soul. The myth describes how the god Osiris dies and is scattered into tiny little pieces. His sister and wife, the goddess Isis, she collects all the little pieces of Osiris and restores him back to life. Every initiate into the mystery cult of Isis knew that this was a parable where Osiris represents the individual human soul, regardless of gender, no longer whole but shattered and scattered, while Isis represents the original wholeness of the all-soul, who through her mercy and great love for humankind actually saves the souls. Yes, Apuleius described her as the saviour goddess or the goddess of salvation hundreds of years before Christ was conceived of. To the initiate of the mysteries of Isis, the myth is a parable of the quest of salvation. I wish to point out that the way that Indian sages, mystics, yogis, tantrics, and classical mystery initiates read their own myths as parables. In fact, the clue as to how to truly discover the depth of meaning that was intentionally conveyed through metaphor in Old Norse myths. The formula is the key. The realization that a myth is not just a fanciful story, but a parable made up of structures, symbols, and metaphors, brought me to later realize that there are formulas within the myths, repeatedly applied by the poets in order to convey a message. There are several basic formulas that are applied time and time again, and the variation between them is due only to what Heiti, nickname, or kenning, metaphor, what sort of Heiti or kenning is used in order to disguise the same elements of the same formulas. Such formulas will be explained throughout this book, but I will mention a few here. A trinity of masculine entities is a formula that is repeated in endless variety in the myth. Yet it is always basically the same trinity, a formula describing the three qualities of human consciousness. There is also a trinity of female entities, and more often a group of 9 female entities, which also constitute a formula that essentially has to do with the fate of the soul. Marriages, lovers, siblings, parents, and offspring, even gender, also provide a formula with which to convey a message about how various virtues or qualities inside interact, whether it be in the cosmos at large or within the individual person. The discovery of the formulas made me realize that the characters of a myth really cannot be interpreted as superhuman persons who do supernatural things, but must be seen as various qualities that reside in the macrocosmos of the world and within the microcosmos of human experience. Truth or fiction, the eyes that see. There are those who recreate the Norse pagan religion today, adhering to it, or rather to a modern version of it, who may be provoked by the revelation of formulas and parables in the myths. The idea that the gods and goddesses merely represents qualities within men and women or within the world at large, or both, means that the gods and goddesses of the stories are not ultimately real. They are poetical inventions in a fiction made by human poets. Yet, this is fiction made by poets who wanted to reveal a profoundly spiritual message of a pan-human universal character, a message of personal spiritual evolution and enlightenment. Some will find this appealing, while others will feel disturbed. And I want to convey one thing very clearly. One of the most beautiful things about these myths is that they are composed in a manner that make them accessible to all people, almost regardless of their basic beliefs and their level of insight and understanding. They can be read as sacred stories and as entertainment, as literal truth and as fiction. Even when read as fiction, they can provide a valuable insight into the minds of the culture that created them. They can also become a transmitter of ageless wisdom and, to some, of spiritual truth. If one really wants to understand this ancient heritage, one ought to keep an open mind and try to avoid imposing stereotypical notions or personal beliefs upon the original sources, but let these speak for themselves. Even if this forces a more complex way of perceiving the pagan gods, who are no longer just superhumans or gods, but poetical characters used to convey a message. One should remember that the poets who created these myths were most probably devout pagans. It is possible to keep two things in one's mind at once. If you like to think of the gods as real superpersons that you can relate to on a personal and literal level, you can still recognize that the myths about them actually employ their personalities and their traditional stories in order to convey a message. A bit like writing a very subjective biography with a secret external agenda about someone famous. If you are more like me, thinking that the gods may be symbolic personalities, yet symbols that have been used to channel or describe real powers of some kind on both a cosmic and on an internal personal level, you can also recognize that the powers and the symbols that describe them can still be used as poetical characters. And if you are of the opinion that the gods and their myths are mere fiction, why, then you will still be able to appreciate the beauty and elegance of ancient literature employing the superstitions of their age in order to convey messages about the human condition and our quest for knowledge and experience. I think I will stop here for today, and I will continue. Next weekend I have a work weekend, so I'm not able to do the live streaming. Hopefully the next live stream will be on Saturday the 27th of August, and I will publish a reading video, recorded video like this in between that, because it's otherwise going to be too long time past, and I really hope that I will be able to get the live stream function to actually function this time, next time. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy. Have a very nice day and week until next time.